Anyway, great word. So we're going to think tonight about three men who stood all their lives on the promises of God. Do have Hebrews 11 open in front of you, folks. And we're also going to need to dip backwards and forward the Old Testament to make sense of what's going on here. Those of you who are parents may have had this experience. I remember more than once when our two sons were very young and playing outside or playing in the house or something. Carol and I would sort of stand and watch them for a moment, and then we'd say, are they really related? You know, are they really brothers? Because they're chalk and cheese. They're so different in personality and temperament and all sorts of things. And that scene came back to my mind as I was thinking, as we look at tonight at the lives of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, because it'd be hard to find, although they're not brothers, of course, they're three different generations, it'd be hard to find three related people who were so different in all sorts of ways. And yet Scripture records their lives for us and sums them up in Hebrews 11 as being men of faith, which is why we're looking at them as we go through Hebrews 11. We looked at Abraham for a couple of studies, and now we're moving on in time to the next three generations. So we have four generations from Abraham through to Joseph, four generations of faith, and sometimes these men failed, sometimes they got it wrong, but the inspired Scriptures hold them up for us overall as men of faith who stood on the promises that God made to them. They weren't perfect, but they were devoted to God and trusted His Word. Two general points I want to make it tonight before we get into the actual passage in front of us, because this will help us both tonight and in some of the coming weeks. A very important principle for studying and reading the Bible is we need to read the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. Okay, we need to read the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. The Old Testament, particularly the historical section, the first 17 books of the Old Testament, give us, if you like, a historical narrative. But the nature of Old Testament history is it doesn't tend to give us comment. It doesn't tend to give us a value judgment. It just gives us the story, and we're supposed to learn the lesson of how things work out. But often in the New Testament, you'll find a New Testament comment on the Old Testament historical narrative. Let me give you just one example that's relevant for us tonight. I want to be slightly careful about this. One of the most maligned people in the Old Testament is Jacob. You know, he's known as the deceiver, the trickster, that's what his name means. And his whole life story, it seems to be a life of manipulation and playing dirty tricks on Laban and one or two others. And there's no doubt that he was a manipulator. But we need to be very careful how we pass judgment on him, because Hebrews 11 says Jacob was a man of faith. So we mustn't somehow write him off, because the New Testament says, hang on a minute, God says Jacob was a man of faith. He was trusting God to get him through life. Not all the time, because nobody does. But generally that was true of his life. So we need to read the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. And the second thing I want to stress to you tonight is that we have to admire the faith of these Old Testament patriarchs. Just think about it. People like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and all the others, of course, in Hebrews 11, they did not have a complete Bible like you and I have. Yet their faith was remarkably strong. They didn't have all the history of God's providence that you and I have, and yet their faith was so strong in God. They handed God's promises down from one generation to another. They kept telling their next generation, hear what God has done in the past, and so they passed it on. And in spite of their failures and their problems, these men and women believed God, and He bore witness to their faith. And of course, most importantly of all, they lived before Calvary. And it often makes me humble, and it rebukes me that I, who have all the history of God's dealings with humanity in the Bible, I who live after Calvary and see the fulfillment of those promises, I who live with the indwelling Holy Spirit, my faith compared to these guys sometimes is tiny. And yet they had so much less to go on than we have. Now, as we look at this passage, at the risk of wearying some of you, but absolutely crucial for our correct understanding of this passage, we need to ask ourselves again the question, what is faith? What is faith? And let me just remind you what I've tried to stress over these recent studies. Faith is not so much something you have, it's something that you do. Faith is not something you feel, it's something you exercise. Faith is not something you work up. Faith is something you live out. Faith is not believing what is possible, faith is believing what has been promised by God. It's not believing what God could do, It's believing what God has said He will do. So I summed it up very briefly many weeks ago as faith is my response to His revelation. He says something, I believe it and I act on it. That's what faith is. So it's not a belief in the unknown, it's a belief in the as yet unseen. It's known because God's told us about it. It's yet unseen because the promises are for the future, many of those times. And we need to bear that in mind as we come to our study this evening. I want to begin by going back to the Old Testament. I want you to take you very quickly through 3 or 4 passages just to set a very important background here. As we look at these 3 individuals, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, all the stories in Hebrews 11 are connected with promises that God gave to Abraham over a period of time, beginning, if you come with me to Genesis chapter 12. We just need to take a moment to read these verses in 4 or 5 places to embed them in our consciousness as we come to the Word of God. So please come with me to Genesis chapter 12 and follow with me the first 3 verses. This is where the story begins, as it were. Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said to Abraham, as before his name has changed, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then sometimes God repeats that promise, but expands it again and again. So turn a few pages to chapter 13, but maybe the same page, chapter 13 and verse 14. This is a good number of years later. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes, look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." Chapter 15 of Genesis and verse 5. God brought Abraham outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to them, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Chapter 17 of Genesis, and from verse 4. "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abraham, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And then just one more just now. Chapter 22. Genesis 22 and verse 17. And this links with our last study in Abraham's life. This is following the substitution of a ram for Isaac on one of the mountains of Moriah. Genesis 22 verse 17. "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Now, without doubt, Abraham repeated those promises to Isaac. But God also repeated them to Isaac. So if you come to chapter 26 of Genesis, or just listen if you get weary of turning all the pages of the Bible. Genesis 26, this is God speaking to Isaac, Abraham's son. "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you." Verse 3, "I will bless you, for to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Abraham repeated to Isaac, and God repeated it to Isaac. Isaac would have repeated it to Jacob, but God also repeated it to Jacob. So if you come to chapter 28, Genesis 28 and verse 13. This is God speaking to Jacob. He's running away from home, as we'll consider in a few moments. And he lies down to sleep at a place that he calls Bethel. Genesis 28 and verse 13. The Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Jacob would have passed those promises on to Joseph. And we read in Genesis 48, a little while ago, I'm going to come back there, Genesis 48. Jacob, dying, gathers his son Joseph's two sons to him. And in verse 4 of Genesis 48, he repeats to Joseph the promise God made to him that we read back there in chapter 28. Genesis 48 verse 3, Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan. Luz is another name for Bethel, by the way. And blessed me and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. However, it's why I've laboured that and read through all those references. It's absolutely important as we understand the examples of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph in exercising their faith. Because the faith that they're exercising is in these promises made to Abraham hundreds of years before, passed down through the generations, because they applied not just to Abraham, but also to his offspring. So Abraham passed them on, and Isaac passed them on, and Jacob passed them on, but God kept reinforcing them and passing them on themselves. And these three men were told by Hebrews 11, all died still holding on to those promises, believing that God was going to keep them. And here's the remarkable thing. We've seen this already about the previous characters in Genesis 11. All the men and women of faith who went before them, and then, none of them ever received the fullness of what God promised them. They all died without receiving it. Remember we looked at that a couple of weeks ago in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They all died without having got them. But did that make them despair? Did it make them write off God? Did it make them call God a liar? No, they believed in God. And they believed that God would keep his promises. And the common thread as we come back to Hebrews 11, verse 20, is these three men, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The common thread here is their continued faith in the promises of God in the face of their own death. We're confronted with these three men at the end of their lives. I call this the three wise men of faith. Let's look at them briefly this evening. First of all, the story of Isaac. The story of Isaac. It's here, verse 20. Notice what it says. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and on Esau. Now just come with me. We're not going to read this, but just have it in front of you if you want. Genesis 27. In case you're not familiar with the story, or let me at least remind you of the story when we get there. Isaac was a very interesting character, very interesting example here. He's the patriarch of all of them that we know the least about. He's a very colourless character. Jacob is colourful, he's full of mischief and all sorts of activities. Joseph is a very interesting character. Isaac is colourless. It's almost hard to work out anything about Isaac's life. He lived the longest of all the patriarchs, but less is recorded about him than about any of the others. So he lived the longest, but he's got the shortest record in Scripture. His whole life story is told in just 3 chapters, 25, 26, and 27 of Genesis. Just compare that for a moment. Abraham is given 14 and a half chapters. Jacob is given 9, Joseph is given 14. Isaac is just given 3.5. Someone has suggested that he was an ordinary son of an extraordinary father who became the ordinary father of an extraordinary son. That's not a great CV, is it? You know, the word that's most associated with you is ordinary. Well, that was Isaac. And yet he's pivotal to the whole purpose and plan of God. Because think about it for a moment. The Bible tells us the issue of spiritual descendancy doesn't depend on whether you're a son of Abraham. It depends on which son of Abraham you're a son of. You get the point? Because Abraham had 2 sons, 2 key sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And it's the son descendancy for Isaac that matters as far as the spiritual descendancy is concerned. Now just have a look, cast your eyes at chapter Genesis 27 just for a moment. And you'll know the story. This is when Jacob, egged on by his mother, deceives his elderly father Isaac. And at first, this seems like the record of the actions of a foolish old man who's had the wool pulled over his eyes. Why on earth did the writer of Hebrews use this as an example of a man of faith? Jacob and Esau, you remember, were warring twins. They were fighting even in the womb before they were born. Now, at this point in the story, Isaac is 130 years old. He's frail, he's almost blind. He's conscious of his impending death. Although, interestingly, he actually lives for another 50 years. Because in these days, people live for a very long time. But he's 130, he's blind, he's usually basically bedridden. He calls Esau his favourite son, and he instructs him regarding the blessing for the eldest son. That was a cultural tradition. As you die, you call in your eldest son, and you pass on all your blessings to him, all your inheritance to him. So Rebekah overhears, because this is a dysfunctional family, Isaac favours Esau, Rebekah favours Jacob. So Rebekah doesn't want Esau to get this blessing, she wants Jacob to get it. So she conjures up this plan. And she gets Jacob to disguise himself as Esau and present himself to his dad, who's blind, so he's fairly easily deceived, it would seem, and present himself and therefore get the blessing. And you know that's what happens. And Esau comes in afterwards, and Isaac realizes what he's done, but he gives a smaller, inferior blessing to his son. You say, well, where's the faith in that? How's that an example of faith? Well, look at chapter 27, verse 33. Here's the faith. And I'll explain in a moment. When Esau comes and says, I am your son, verse 33, then Isaac trembled very violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came. And I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. The literal Hebrew in that expression, he trembled greatly, says he trembled with a great trembling exceedingly. I have blessed him and he shall be blessed. Let me just take you back without finding the reference. 70 years just before the birth of Jacob and Esau. And God says to Isaac and to his wife Rebekah that you're not to follow the normal course of events here. Although Esau will be born first, Jacob is to have the primacy. You're to treat Jacob as the eldest, although Esau is biologically the eldest. That was before they were born. It's worth reminding ourselves, by the way, that when we read the story of Jacob and Esau almost fighting all the way through their lives, here in chapter 27, they're not a couple of teenagers fighting with each other. They're both in their 70s at this particular point. And so as they come to Isaac to receive this blessing, Isaac had forgotten that prophetic promise of God given 70 years ago. He followed his natural instincts. He followed the simple preferences of one son over another. So he wanted to give the father's blessings to the firstborn, to Esau. Notice it, the language is very strong here. He relies on his natural senses. It tells in verse 21 of chapter 27. Isaac said to Jacob, please come near me that I may feel you, my son. He says in verse 27, he smelled the countryside in his clothing. He says in verse 25, he tasted the delicious food. It's all about the natural senses, relying on your own wisdom and judgment. But for years, Isaac has ignored God's word in the prophecy given before their birth. He's ignored the fact that Esau, his eldest son, has given up his birthright, because remember, he traded it for a bowl of soup. He's forgotten that Esau, his favourite son, is marrying numerous idolatrous pagan women. And he ignores all of that because he likes him, he favours him over Jacob. He's a man driven and guided by his physical appetite and his physical senses. But now he's been deceived. And suddenly he realizes that he's almost made a grave mistake. And he's almost given to Esau what he should have given to Jacob. And so when Esau comes and presents himself, when the record says he trembled greatly, what we're being told is that suddenly Isaac realized God had spared him from making a terrible mistake. Yes, he'd been deceived, and God doesn't for a moment condone the deceit and the manipulation that Rebekah and Jacob played on his father, but God overruled him that and used that to stop Isaac making a terrible mistake and passing on the blessing and inheritance to the wrong guy. And he says, here's the faith. Yes, I have blessed him, and he shall be blessed. I'm not going to change my mind. I've suddenly realized the mistake I always made, so I'm not going back. Jacob will be blessed because God said he'd be blessed. That's a statement of faith, friends. It's a statement of faith. And by faith, Jacob, we're told in Hebrews 11, invoked future blessings. Note the order, not future blessings on Esau and Jacob, but on Jacob and Esau. The normal process has been reversed. Always you put the oldest one first. No, it's Jacob and Esau, not Esau and Jacob. Friends, it's a powerful story of a man who suddenly realizes he's almost made a terrible mistake, but God in his sovereign overruling has prevented him from doing so, so he's not going to compound it by reversing what he's done. I have blessed him and he will be blessed. It's an example of God's faithfulness to his own word and his promises, and his faithfulness overrules even when our stupidity and our senselessness and our sinfulness seem to overrule God's purposes. That's Isaac, and we'll come back and draw some final lessons as we close. Let's look at verse 21 of Hebrews 11. Here's Jacob, the deceiver, the manipulator, the one who deceived his father. And the background here is Genesis 48 that we read a few moments ago. And when we pick it up in Genesis 48, and you remember the story that Jacob has been separated from Joseph for many, many years. Because Joseph was sold off by his brothers. Joseph was the ruler in Egypt for many years. And so many years, Jacob didn't see his favorite son, Joseph. But in chapter 48, he's reconciled. He's been in Egypt for a while, and now he's coming to the end of his life. And like Isaac many years before him, he wants to bless Joseph's sons. Notice, by the way, not Joseph, but Joseph's sons, for a moment. Look at chapter 48, verse 3. We read it a moment ago. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And do you know what? He hadn't got it. That was the promise made to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, now passed on to Jacob, but it hasn't happened yet. He's not a multitude of peoples. There were only 70 of them in the family. It's hardly a multitude compared to the number of stars in the skies. He hadn't yet received the promise, but he still believed that God would do it, if not in his life, in somebody else's life. Only God didn't do it to him, so God would do it to somebody else down the line. So he calls his two grandsons to him, and effectively says to them, I'm going to pass the blessing on to you, the promise on to you. And he effectively adopts, look what he says in verse 5, your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to Egypt, are mine, Ephraim and Manasseh. I'm going to count them as mine, so I can pass on inheritance and blessings to them, just as if they were mine. Now, friends, I need to stress here, we need to remember this. This is not a case of passing on the family heirlooms. This is not a case of passing on what's in the bank. This is a case of passing on the promises of God. This is Abraham passing on to Isaac, and Isaac on to Jacob, and now Jacob on to Joseph's sons. The promises of the blessing of God. It's a massively important thing, and you don't do that without doing what God has told you to do. You can give your money to whoever you want. But what they're doing is passing on these generational blessings. It's got to be to the right person. But Jacob is blind, we're told, like his father when he deceived him. Jacob is blind here. So Joseph positions his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So the eldest is at Jacob's right hand because you pronounce the blessing with your right hand. But Jacob deliberately crosses his hands over and puts his right hand on the younger son, Ephraim, and the left hand on the older son, Manasseh. The Hebrew language is very colourful here. It says in English that let me find it here. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands. The Hebrew says he made his hands to understand. It's a very deliberate act what he was doing. That's what the Hebrews say. A very deliberate act. Joseph tries to correct his father. Verse 17. Father, this is wrong. You've got the wrong around. I appreciate you're blind. You've got this wrong, but just put your hands back the way I had them in the first place. But Jacob insists. Verse 19. I know, my son, I know. And Jacob deliberately communicates the blessing to the younger of the two sons of Joseph, not to the older. Now, I need to fill you a bit more history, just briefly. So important here. Jacob is effectively putting right a great wrong done to him many years beforehand. Do you remember when Jacob fled from Esau? After that issue with deceiving their father, Esau's blood was up. He was going to kill his brother. So Isaac says to Jacob, Jacob, you need to go away from here. I need to go back to my family in Paddan Aram and be safe there, but also find a wife for them, because I don't want you taking one of these Canaanite women to be your wives. So he goes to Paddan Aram, he meets his uncle Laban, and there he meets the lovely Rachel. And he wants Rachel to be his wife. But Laban, who is the real twister, says, well, you can have Rachel if you work for 7 years. So, for 7 years, the Bible tells us, Rachel was so beautiful that 7 years seemed to pass by in no time at all. And Jacob worked for 7 years, and then Laban tricked him and actually gave him Leah, who the Bible says was plain. And so Jacob had to work another 7 years in order to get Rachel. Now here's the point, here's the relevance. Jacob's oldest son was not Joseph, because Leah had a number of sons before the delightful Rachel produced a son. Joseph was Rachel's eldest, but not Leah's oldest. Do you get the point? Rachel was the one Jacob wanted from the very beginning. So what Jacob is doing now at the end of his life is he's effectively rewriting history to treat Joseph's sons as if they were Joseph himself, and as if Joseph was the firstborn, because he was Rachel's firstborn, even if he wasn't Leah's firstborn. I hope you've got that. Why? Because God had told him the promises are to go through Ephraim, not through Manasseh. Through Joseph's younger, not through his older. How did Jacob know that? Well, there's only one way he could have known. God must have told him. That's why I stressed again tonight, my friends. Faith is not about, I had a bright idea, or this is what I would like, or I had a daydream. Faith is about listening to what God has said and acting on it. God must have said to Jacob, bless Ephraim above Manasseh. Because that's what he did. So he bypassed the cultural norms. And it's interesting, again, we don't read about Esau and Jacob, but that's the natural order. We read about Jacob and Esau. So neither do we read about Manasseh and Ephraim, but that's the natural order. We read about Ephraim and Manasseh. And Ephraim is another name for Israel. The nation of Israel is the nation of Ephraim. So the promises are being passed on where God wanted to be passed on, not where the natural preferences were. Here's the third story, Joseph. And you know the story of Joseph better, most of you, I'm sure, than even Isaac and Jacob. He's a remarkable character in Scripture, one of the very few in the Bible for whom there's no negative or critical words. And yet that's all the more remarkable considering his life. So you will know the story. If you don't, you ought to go home and read those last 15 or so chapters of Genesis where his life is told. And then when you think about the way his family treated him, you would think he would have abandoned his faith. And yet we're told at the end of his life he was still walking by faith in God. He was sold by his brothers as a 17-year-old into slavery in a foreign country. He was unjustly imprisoned for several years before being released and then promoted to second in command in a foreign land. He lived in a profoundly pagan and ungodly culture. And yet none of that weakened his trust or his faith in God. Joseph did not use his family, his job, his circumstances as an excuse for unbelief. But he would have grown up in those early years having heard from his father and from his grandfather the promises of God given to Abraham many years before. All those verses we read from Genesis, Joseph would have known all those almost off by heart. And those promises included the fact that God would one day deliver his people from Egypt. Why do you think God had raised Joseph to be number 2 in Egypt? So that he could begin the process for the Exodus. 430 years later. And when Jacob, do you notice this in chapter 48 of Genesis? When Jacob blessed his 2 sons, he repeats the promise given to Abraham, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. But then come down the end of chapter 48, verse 21. Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. How do we know that? Because he made that promise to Abraham. God had said to Abraham, long before Isaac, Jacob were in charge of the world. Abraham, in many years to come, your people are going to be enslaved in a foreign land, but I'm going to bring them out of there. And Abraham passed the promise to Isaac, and Isaac passed it to Jacob, and Jacob passed it to Joseph. And so says the writer in Hebrews 11 and verse 22. Joseph, as he was dying, spoke about the exodus of the people from Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Why? Because he'd heard the promises. He's an old man, he's dying, but he knows that in the future God is going to deliver his people from Egypt. And he believes it with all his heart. So his last instructions to his family are, one day God will set you free, and when he sets you free, take my bones with you, because I don't belong here, in death or in life. And that's exactly what they did. We're told in the story of the Exodus, in Exodus chapter 13, that in all the busyness and all the activity of leaving Egypt in the middle of the night, they took the bones of Joseph with them. And we're told in the book of Joshua how they were buried back in the promised land. Joseph had spent all but 17 of his 110 years in Egypt, but he knew that Egypt wasn't his home. Somewhere else was home. Friends, I hope you understand why we spent an awful lot of time in history this evening. It's fundamental to understanding what Hebrews 11 and 20, 21, 22 is about. What were Isaac and Jacob and Joseph doing? They were standing on the promises. And they'd been standing on the promises all their lives. They were old men. Joseph was 110 when he died. And yes, there were ups and downs and they fell, but to the end of their life they were standing on the promises. Why? Because chapter 11 of Hebrews is written to underline a principle at the end of chapter 10. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. So 11 is all about giving examples of people who lived and died by faith. They didn't give up. The people of the Hebrews in this church here are tempted to throw in the towel, give it up, it's too tough. Life is much easier with Jews practicing the Judaistic religion. And the writer says, now if you're really converted and you're really saved, then you're just like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, you'll hang on in there and you'll stand on the promises of God. So what can we make of all this? So let's only draw some lessons that I think we're being told here in Hebrews 11 about faith. These people, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and all the others in Hebrews 11, they had faith in the promises of God. Let me unpack it just briefly as we close. Bear with me. First of all, they had faith in the electing purposes of God. There's one of those words that makes Christians bristle with nervousness. But listen to this. God chose Jacob, not Esau. God chose Ephraim, not Manasseh. God chose Joseph, not Reuben, who was actually Jacob's firstborn. And Paul uses that very example in Romans 9, and we looked at this many, many months ago when we were working our way through Romans. Let me just read this to you from Romans chapter 9 and verse 9. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return and Sarah shall have a son. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born, and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And so Isaac suddenly realizes, in the denseness of his old, dim brain, I nearly blew it. And God graciously overruled, because I was going by natural senses and natural tradition and cultural practice, and God made me say, that's not how God works. God works by election, by choosing those whom he will choose. They had faith in the electing purpose of God. They had faith in the providence of God, the way that God orders our affairs and circumstances. You know the story well. Remember at the end of Joseph's, almost the end of his life, when introduce himself back to his brothers who've come to him, and he makes himself known to them. This is what we read in Genesis 45. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Listen, God sent me before you. The Bible describes the spectacular sin of the brothers selling their brother. God describes it as God's way of sending Joseph to Egypt in order to save the very ones who are trying to kill him. They try to kill Joseph. God gets him to Egypt so that in a few years' time he can keep his brothers alive in the time of the famine. And the Psalms, when it speaks about the situation, says, when God summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as slave. You see that? God knew the famine was coming. God knew the Exodus was coming. So he sends Joseph. All his brothers did a nasty trick on him and sold him. God sent him. It was not that God foresaw a famine happening on its own, or that the famine was caused by God and God stepped in to save Jacob's family. The Bible is explicit. God summoned the famine. God summoned the famine. And beforehand he prepared the deliverance from it. Friends, this is the providence of God. It's the only way we can make sense of the world, isn't it? If not, the world's out of control. Or if not, the world is in the control of the dark demonic forces of evil. But no, God is in control. God is working all things out to bring about his purposes. And these men who died couldn't always make sense of it. It didn't always happen in their time. The problems weren't resolved in their lifetime. But they believed God and they died in faith. So what do we learn about faith itself? Well, again, the connecting theme between these three wise men of faith is the examples chosen by the writer all about the end of their lives. Through all their long lives. Joseph died at 110. He was sold by his brothers at the age of 17. So all those years he's lived in a foreign land in Egypt. In all the godlessness and all the injustice he suffered. But not once did he take his eye off the promises of God. He persevered to the end. These were men with real faith, because men with real faith not only live by faith, but they die by faith. They weren't dreamers, they weren't wishful thinkers. They saw invisible realities. Hebrews 11 tells us they did not receive these things, but they saw them from afar. As Joseph says to his sons, I'm dying, but God is going to send you back to Canaan. He saw that in his eyes. It was so real. Why? Because God had said it. He didn't need the scientific proof. He hadn't got some amazing eyesight that could make him look 400 years of vision. He knew because God had said it's going to happen. That's great faith, isn't it? Despite all that he'd gone through in his life. They didn't just die in despair saying, it's never going to happen, God's broken his word, God can't be trusted. They died saying, it will happen. It will happen. Why? Because God said it. They are men who lived by faith, but the reality of their faith was shown at the end of their lives. You see, my friend, the acid test of the reality of your faith is, does it do you any good when you're dying? And does it do you any good when you look back and you actually see that some of the promises God made, maybe in your lifetime in the way you expected, didn't happen? Faith in the word and the promises and the faithfulness of God. John Brown was an old Scottish minister in Haddington many years ago. And the story is told of him as he went to visit an elderly saint in the church, a lady who was dying. A godly lady who lived most of her life in a close fellowship with the Lord. And John Brown said to her, what will happen, what will you lose if when you die you discover that there's no such thing as heaven? And she said, God will lose more than I will lose. A wise statement, isn't it? God will lose his integrity, God will lose his trustworthiness, God will lose his reliability. Hallelujah, lose heaven. There's a woman who died in faith. If your faith is no good then, Your faith is no good, full stop. These people died without fear because they believed the word of God with promises to them. Job. I love the old character of Job in the Bible. This is what Job said. And remember, again, I stress, Job lived at the same time as Isaac and Esau and Jacob, by the way. He lived without the revelation of the Bible. He lived long before Calvary. But this is what Job says. Even if worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and not another. Now, what an amazing statement of faith. He wasn't afraid of death because he knew he'd see God. Not he hoped he'd see God. Not he thought the odds were stacked in the favour of seeing God. He knew that he would see God. He died, if you like, with a smile on his face. Because he knew he'd see God. Why? Because he had the promise of God no matter. Friends, should a Christian be afraid to die? Absolutely not. We may be nervous about the process or the manner in which we die. That's natural, but the Christian has nothing to fear about death. Because there are countless promises in the Word of God that for a Christian to die is to go into the nearer presence of Jesus. What is there to fear about that? Read 1 Corinthians 15, "O death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory?" Jesus has conquered death. Why do people fear death? I'll tell you why they fear death. The Bible tells us why they fear death. The sting of death is sin. The reason people don't want to die is because deep in their consciousness they have an awareness that when they die they are sinners and they're going to face the judgment of God, and that's the most terrifying thing in the world, and so it should be to them. That's why people are afraid to die. That's what the Bible says. Christian, if you're a Christian, you've got nothing to be afraid of. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. If you die tonight, you go straight ahead and be with Jesus. What's not to like about that? Do you believe God has a place for you? Do you believe God will keep you safe? Do you believe all the promises of God? Do you believe there's a place in the Father's house that Jesus prepared? Then what's there to fear? And you say, well, it's okay for these great men like Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. But me? Little old me? Well, friends, go back and read the stories. They were no different to us. They were weak, they were sinful, they were manipulative, they were deceitful, they were weak, they sometimes failed, they sometimes blew it, they messed up, sometimes they were immoral. They lived hundreds of years before Christ and Calvary and the cross, but they believed God. And when the writer of Hebrews sums them up in one sentence, he says, by faith they died. Because by faith they lived. And they believed God all the way to death. And friends, that's how you and I are called to live and believe. That's the call of Hebrews 11. That's how we're to live. Don't throw in the towel. Yes, I know it's tough. But if God breaks a promise of His word to you, it'll be the first time in the history of the universe it's ever happened. And I give you a categorical assurance on the authority of the word of God, it's not going to happen. Every promise He's made will come true. And He will keep you. That's what it means to live by faith. To live by faith means to die by faith. So my question to you, very simply, as we close this evening, I appreciate you bearing with me, we covered a huge amount of ground tonight, we had to do it all in one go, is this: are you ready to die? Are you ready to die? Because if you're not ready to die, you're not ready to live. Get your death sorted out before you sort out your life. Be ready to die, because that's going to come any time, certainly, if the Lord doesn't come back first. And you're not ready to die until you're holding on the promise of God, standing on the promises of Christ my King. Friends, if you're not ready to die tonight, I beg with you, I plead with you tonight, talk to somebody at the end of this meeting. We'll help you find out how you can put aside that fear of death and you can stand on the promise. What I meant to say as we began was we're going to try tonight, after we got some tea and coffee, we're going to have a question and answer session. So if you've got questions about all of this faith and dying, let's talk, let's ask questions and discuss it a little bit and help one another if you think these things through. So don't rush off, if you can stay a little bit longer, and we'll do that. But let's just take a moment to pray before we sing again and close our service. Father, we've covered a massive amount of history and biblical material, and I pray for your help for all of us that we can process that as is necessary for us.